Ronan, can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Hello.
Fantastic. My apologies. Just a little bit of cross wires there. Actually, there's an update to perhaps what you wanted to mention with regards to legislation that we already have in force on the front of the Irish Times this morning. The Gardaí are saying that they firstly know they have a fairly good idea as to who brought the mock gallows through the Dáil. They are now thinking of, or there is talk about an investigation in that regard, something along the lines of a criminal investigation, and that the legislation that they would use would be legislation including incitement to hatred, public order, and laws against threatening or intimidating behaviour. It sounds to me that they have enough laws to work with without looking for more on the statute books, right?
That's exactly what I think. I mean, I think clearly what we saw the day before yesterday was, first of all, a small number of people. We need to keep this in perspective. This was not the January the 6th or anything like it. But clearly, some of the people there were the wrong people, protesting in the wrong way and probably about the wrong things. But that's not to say that somewhere in there, naively or otherwise, there were some people who might have seen themselves as the right people protesting in the right way, in other words, peacefully, but determinedly, about the right things. And I was actually chatting with a journalist from the Irish Times this morning, and we were just discussing whether even the whole coverage of this, giving it so much oxygen, it gives some of the gouger element exactly what they want out of this, you know. So yeah,
and it could strengthen them for the next time, you believe?
Yeah, and embolden them, and you know they're looking for notice so as to kind of spread an incoherent message, you know, about things that they think they're worried about. But I think they're dishonest people, because to some degree, let's say, they have a desire to foment disorder, and they're only a small number of people, and some of them are what you might call the hard right. But I would also say, you know, there is a hard left in this country as well that's full of hatred, and the fact that some of them get elected to Dáil, it doesn't mean that they're not a threat in some way in the longer term to the stability.
How are the left a threat, though?
Because in the end, they believe in violence, even where they fail at the ballot box. You know, it just gets to some of them would, you know, according to their doctrine and dogma, await that critical moment. You know, I see myself in some ways on some issues centre left, in some ways I'm probably centre right. Some people say conservative, but at the end of the day, you know, what I want to see is an active civil society where people seek to persuade towards good laws that work for the common good and protect the vulnerable and so on. What I see at the moment is an element, a small element, who don't believe in kindness. I suppose when we were a more Christian country and we use language like morality, you know, you could point to people putting up, you know, ugly signs, bad language, abusive behaviour, you know, a hangman's noose, and you say, you know, that's morally wrong in the sense, because it promotes disorder, it promotes violence, it promotes hatred towards other people and not love of neighbour. That language isn't as common in our discourse now, but to some degree I think...
Unless you're north of the border with the division between Catholics and Protestants for many years.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not saying that it abolishes all human sin and wrongdoing, but, you know, we need to consider that there is a moral element to how we should communicate our ideas.
But just looking at a couple of their ideas, for instance, they you would say that they don't have any kindness. They would say that they have kindness to our children, who they feel are being indoctrinated at way too young an age with regards to sexuality and issues like that. They would say also, like many people would possibly agree with them, that we have no controls over our borders anymore, and people who are coming up and tearing up their passports on airplanes. Surely they're valid arguments.
Yeah, and you're putting your finger on two issues that need to be talked about, and on immigration.
But those are two platforms that they're very front and centre about.
Okay, well, let's talk about this, because I also see mainstream politicians seeking to use this small amount of disorder in order to push an agenda I certainly don't agree with either. So let's on the immigration, I believe in a policy that our immigration laws should be generous but structured but generous. And we can't have open borders, but we need a sensible and fair immigration policy. And not everything that's done by the government is rational in this area. And certainly, you know, certainly a lot of the values, however, of some of those who protest around this issue would I think take us into a very uncharitable place. So there's a balance that I would like to see struck there. But on the line,
but that's just doing nothing at all. That's just to sit on your hands answer. I mean,
it isn't really, because you could have a situation where we will have quotas, for how we will deal with things, and we will have clear distinctions between that you would always make sure that there is a safe means of application for asylum for people who are fleeing terror, violence, death, and then where it comes to the wider challenge of,
but we can't house our own. I mean, there's no stopping this.
Let's not go down. You can't solve this in a couple of minutes. All I'm trying to say is there is a balance to be struck between having, I would say we should be generous but structured. I see the government sometimes just does down any kind of disquiet around the immigration thing as though it's racism, and that's dishonourable as far as I would see on the part of those politicians who do that, and it's not going to help the long-term debate, because it's going to drive discontent underground. You talk about indoctrination of children. Certainly I already see Micheál Martin, and who I don't trust on these issues now, I have to say, and then I say that more in sorrow than in anger, seeking to link these protesters with protests around libraries, and also suggesting that this is why we need hate speech legislation. You've made the point yourself. We have the laws to deal with intimidating, ugly, violent, dangerous behaviour that puts people at risk. On the question of indoctrination of children, it is definitely the case that protest is needed about the lack of child protection involved in the provision of certain materials in our libraries and making them available to young children. It's scandalous what's going on. I haven't been on the ground, so I don't know what kind of protests have gone on about that, but I would say that certainly... Well,
it's been in front of and inside of libraries and up in staff members' faces, filming them on mobile phones.
And that's to be condemned. But, loud and vocal protest on the street, that's an absolute disgrace that the state is potentially endangering children by not having regard to child protection rules, about the provision of extreme, like if parents brought home some of the material that I've been told and have seen is available in libraries and showed it to their children, you would suggest that there could be child protection issues in that home.
Have you read any of the material? Because I have.
I to be honest with you, it's really ugly stuff. I've seen enough. I've been made aware enough to know that there is a genuine need for public disquiet about this, and I think it's irresponsible of people like Leo Varadkar and Micheál Martin, both of which have adverted this. If they only talk about the unacceptability, which I agree with, of any kind of thing that would be personally intimidating of, let's say, people working in libraries who are just doing their job. And if at the same time they don't say, but we do need to look at what's being made available in these libraries and whether there are child protection issues, whether children are being sexualized, or whether there's an agenda involved in the provision of some of these books that needs to be tackled. That's the other side of the equation.
Okay, and let me put that point actually to the Irish Council of Civil Liberties. Let me bring in Liam Herrick, the Executive Director of the Irish Council of Civil Liberties, because that's an interesting point. Liam, good morning.
Good morning, Neil.
Would it make more sense to listen to what the protesters have to say?
Well, the right to protest is a fundamental part of our democracy, and the right applies regardless of what your views are. And you're allowed to make your views in an aggressive way, in a provocative way, up to the point of being rude and offensive, and you can cause a level of disruption. And that applies whatever your views are on the political spectrum. But the line, I think, is that it is a right to peaceful protest, and when a protest goes over the line and calls for violence against politicians, journalists or others, and actually engages in violence, as we saw on Wednesday, that is where the line is crossed. And when we talk about the groups that were involved in Wednesday, there was clear violence and there was an intention to cause violence and to harm people. And
was anybody actually hurt? Was anybody hurt or had hands laid upon them? I mean, there was bustling and jostling.
There was bustling and jostling, and I think the guards did a good job in protecting the safety of people, but arrests were made, and I think prosecutions will follow with regard to that, and obviously we can't talk about those. But I think, you have to look at the message that's there. There's a distinction between having a view on any of the issues that you raised there, Neil, on migration policy, on education, on free speech, whatever it might be. Whatever your view is one thing. But if you're calling for action that is talking about violence against other people, you're inciting violence, well, that is unacceptable.
So we're back to the gallows then, and the Dáil around the rope and things like that.
I think the gallows is interesting when you examine who these groups are. They put up a gallows and they put up a series of pictures of people from all of the main political parties, left and right. And the clear message was that there is a conspiracy between all of the main political parties and all of the journalists and all of the civil society groups that is either the two principal ones they're talking about, a conspiracy to replace the Irish people with foreigners. It's a racist conspiracy, which in fairness Ronan has very clearly said that he would be very much opposed to and always has been opposed to. And the other conspiracy that they talk about is there's a conspiracy to harm children, with some sort of conspiracy between some people within government and other agencies to harm children. Now, the people that were leading the event in Kildare Street on Wednesday are the same people, and it's identified across all the newspapers today, are the same people that have been leading the library protests in Cork in particular and elsewhere, and also the protests at refugee centres. So we know who these people are, we know what they're about, and their ammunition is a conspiracy theory approach. And in fairness to Ronan, he himself in the last couple of months has tweeted about, is there a conspiracy of a government within a government with regard to the library protest issue, which I think is very unfortunate, because that's the kind of message that these groups
What does that even mean? Ronan, what does that even mean? Conspiracy.
Well, you see, I've been critical of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, actually, because while I agree with a lot and have shared a platform with the ICCL on some issues in the past, I think they have abandoned for example, in relation to the hate speech legislation, they pointed to several flaws. For example, the lack of definition of hatred, and they reference various international instruments that should be followed. But now they've lost their voice, and they seem to be happy to let the hate speech legislation in its very controversial form going through. So I think they've abandoned their kind of responsibility to the public. I'm a bit disappointed with the ICCL on a number of things. But regarding just to address very head on what Liam has said there on what I'm talking about, what I'm saying is this, that a government within a government refers to a situation where you have NGOs and people with a particular agenda who have certain ideas about values that they want to change in our society, and they have privileged access. They don't get challenged, and you see them getting resources then pushed.
That wasn't the context, Ronan.
Well, the context
that wasn't the context for the comment.
Sorry, it was. I was.
No, Ronan. The context was that Leo Varadkar.
Speaking about Leo.
Well, you were talking about Leo Varadkar defending the library workers in Cork, and you criticised Leo Varadkar specifically for speaking out in favour of the library workers in Cork, and you said, is this an example of a government within government? And that has been a slogan of the library protesters, that gay and lesbian politicians within government have been controlling an agenda within government. Now, maybe you don't share their view, but that's what they mean by it.
Sorry, you're being utterly incoherent here.
No, he's not. I understood exactly what he said.
I am saying quite clearly, and by the way, there are many people working in libraries, and some of them have written to the press about this, who are very concerned about the fact that such material is available in the library.
The staff themselves are concerned about the material, but can't voice it publicly.
Members who are exactly.
Okay.
So when I say a government,
but do you stand over maybe an accusation that gay politicians are pushing a gay agenda?
No, I'm very careful not to target anybody in relation to their private life, and I never will do that. But what I am saying is that yes, in relation to, I suppose you could say there's a difference between conspiracy and collusion. There is undoubtedly a silence and a facilitation within government around certain ideas and values, and we see this. But
did you reference something that was posted about Leo Varadkar in that regard?
If I did, I'm sure I did so correctly. I don't have it in front of me, but I'm not pleased, and I think I'm very concerned about the attitude not just of Leo Varadkar, but of Micheál Martin and others. There is a complete failure to address the child protection issue that is at the heart of what is in some of this library material, at least what has been drawn to my attention.
Yeah.
And until
but if you're that concerned about it, why don't you pick up the book, This Book is Gay, and have a read of it?
until we get them facing up to that question, and until we get media asking them that question, then frankly, yes, I am going to say that some NGOs have a privileged access and are closing down the debate and are putting some kind of a silencer on the government, because the government is silent on the child protection dimension of this issue, just as Liam Herrick and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties is silent on the child protection dimension of this issue. And I think they need to be asked really hard questions about that.
Is that child issue within the remit of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, Liam?
Of course it is, Neil, and we care deeply about you. I mean, I'm a parent myself. I've got young children, I have teenage kids. It's such an absurd argument, because I think, as all of your listeners who have kids know, we all care about what material our kids see, and we worry about them seeing inappropriate material. I worry about this all the time, but I have to say that the last place I'm worried about is our public libraries that are run by expert, ethical public servants. There are plenty of other places I'd be concerned about my kids seeing inappropriate material. That's why in the Irish Council for Civil Liberties and many other organisations, we work very hard on the issue of online safety and online regulation. We make submissions on legislation at the Irish level and the European level, and we're involved in litigation at the European level about the problem about unregulated online spaces. But every parent in Cork knows that the public library is not the risk here.
I don't think, Neil, many people will be reassured by Liam's, trust me, we're experts, and if we're not worried about it, you shouldn't be either. That's the kind of patronising NGO privileged access approach that actually has a lot of people worried, and that has some people very legitimately protesting, and I'm not talking about the nasty. So if Liam can't even say, that there is a problem about, excuse me, I'm coughing here, about some of the material that has been drawn to public attention about what's in this library, which you could not read out on air, and which I have no intention
Actually, I did portions of it. Just difficult and all as it was for me as a parent to read it out.
Well, you're a better man than I am. I just needed to have drawn to my attention the basic essentials about what some has been pushed at children as young as 12 in libraries in the juvenile section, to know there is a clear failure of leadership in this area, and that can only be connected with the fact that there's some kind of an agenda to say that this is all okay.
Okay, do we have enough legislation, Liam? They're talking about exclusion zones around the Dáil now, 1.6 kilometres if there's a protest, closing off streets around it full time so people can no longer get anywhere close to it. We have existing legislation, loads of it, incitement to hatred, public order, threatening behaviour, intimidating behaviour, and on top of that, the proposed increase in hate speech, that if I was on the street having a conversation with somebody about something I believed to be my opinion, a third party could report me to the Gardaí.
Well, there's a couple of different issues in that, Neil, but specifically with regard to protests at Leinster House, I don't think there's any case that we should change the law. I think any of the politicians I've spoken to in the last couple of days would be against that. I know the Ceann Comhairle has raised a suggestion of kind of areas around Leinster House. I don't think that would be constitutional. I don't think it'd be appropriate. But I do think that we need a real approach which deals with these groups that are clearly intent on violence. And I would call on all elected representatives who have shared platforms with these groups or amplified their messages on whatever issues it might be, that they need to distance themselves.
But you said earlier on, to quote you, that people have a right to protest, to be rude, offensive and disruptive.
That's right, as long as it doesn't extend to violence and incitement to violence, which is what we saw on Wednesday. I mean, I think that we have a very robust political culture here. We have a robust political culture where people can make their point quite forcefully. And many TDs that I've spoken to in the last couple of days have said that, they do get some abusive comments thrown to them from time to time, but they actually think it's appropriate that they should meet protesters as they go in and out, as long as there's no issue of safety. And there was an issue of safety on Wednesday. Michael Healy-Rae was threatened, Donna O'Leary was threatened, and there's been a pattern over the last year or so. We've had Holly Kearns harassed, we've had Breed Smith knocked over, Paul Murphy, Lucinda Creighton previously was harassed, Jennifer Carroll McNeil. Particularly women politicians have been vulnerable to it. So there's an issue of safety, which I think the guards and the security in Leinster House will work on, and I think that they can resolve. But I would be completely against any change to the right to protest in Ireland. I don't think there's widespread support for that. The one exception, and I think Ronan will probably want to bring this in, is that there's legislation before the House to restrict people gathering outside hospitals and GP surgeries, because there is, in my view, the correct view that when you're accessing health treatment, you deserve dignity and privacy. And
are you referencing terminations there?
Yeah, there's the legislation being proposed for safe access zones around hospitals so that women, when they are going to access health services, will not be harassed or impeded.
Yes, yeah. That's a 200-metre limit, I think, is it, Liam?
I think it's less than that.
Is
but
it less than that?
The purpose is, but I think it's a very interesting distinction. You know, people have a constitutional right to express a political view at our national parliament, because that's a matter of public policy. But when I am trying to go to a doctor, people don't have a right to protest and harass against me. And I mean, the question that always comes back to me is this: if you have a view about the law in this country about abortion, you are perfectly entitled. It's a very important matter of public policy. You are perfectly entitled to express that political view. But you are not entitled to harass women as they're going in and out of hospitals. And sadly, Ronan supports that type of activity, which continues to go on today.
Do you support people being allowed to harass and protest outside a doctor's surgery where maybe GPs are giving advice or maybe medication for terminations, Ronan?
Well, you know what, I might take this opportunity to say, if people want to check out what I say on Twitter at Ronan Mullen, they'll see that I'm trying to give a kind of leadership that says that there are many issues we need to protest about, but there is a way to do it that is always respectful of the other person. And I have never ever, and it is interesting that the one issue where the Irish Council for Civil Liberties and Liam will support kind of censorious preventive activity is where it's in support of a very radical and powerful pro-abortion agenda, when in fact we've had in recent times claims from a pro-abortion NGO that there was intimidation of people, first at Limerick, then they shifted their focus to Cork, and in each case the university...
I can tell you that there have been protests, and there have been people outside surgeries in Cork.
And in each case, the university hospital said that they had no complaints from patients. That's the first thing. The reality in this country is that we have...
I filled a programme on it a few months ago where people were protesting. They certainly were. And people were annoyed and unhappy about it.
All I'm telling you is you have very little of this kind of activity going on, and it's very few people, and it is generally very, very respectful people. And you see, because the way abortion sadly has been medicalised in this country, corrupting really medicine by just integrating it into hospitals and GPs, you actually don't know. It's not like in other countries where...
But it's none of your business, surely. It is not actually anybody's business.
On abortion. So what I'm really trying to say is, this is using a mallet in order to crash enough. What this is really about is trying to suppress dissent on this issue. It's not about protecting people who might be upset or intimidated. We haven't had any complaints to hospitals about people. So you kind of have to look at it for what it is. It's people basically seeking to exercise power to crush dissent. And it's very interesting that the Irish Council of Civil Liberties has no problem with that. Why is that?
Okay, I'll move on to the call.
There's no crushing of dissent. I mean, there's no crushing of dissent. I actually was in O'Connell Street in Dublin. Sorry, Ronan. If I can just make a point.
Let him respond, because I'm going to move on in a second, Ronan, so I'll give him an opportunity.
An organisation that sets itself up as protecting people, but the most vulnerable people on the planet, unborn children, they have no interest in protecting. And I just think that's...
Liam, finally.
I mean, the idea of crushing dissent, I think, is kind of ridiculous. I mean, I was in O'Connell Street in Dublin several weeks ago, and a very large national anti-abortion march went through. Very significant numbers of people, very peaceful, very well organised, very powerfully making their point. It was reported in national media extensively. There's a lot of politicians there. So the idea that people who have... the same views as Ronan on abortion are being crushed from dissent.
Okay, good. Okay, that's a good example. But finally, if Helen McEntee's hate speech comes in and somebody marches like that and holds a sign, this is a question for you, Liam, holds a sign that says that abortion is murder, will that be a prosecutable offence then?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's no question of that whatsoever. I mean, when we look at the hate speech legislation that's currently proposed, in fairness, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties identified some difficulties with the speech elements of it from the beginning. Ronan has subsequently also articulated many of the same points. In fairness, I think that we identified some of the same...
And called you guys out for standing back from your initial concerns.
We haven't stand back from our initial concerns, Ronan, but
you're cheerleading for the legislation without any of your requested amendments being made. Yeah. You have abandoned it. And the reason you have, by the way, Liam, is because the coalition against hate crime seems to have swamped the Irish Council for Civil Liberties' initial views. So you've censored yourself.
That's a complete... Ronan, I'll explain where we stand if you want.
And I think we should also ask whether you guys are compromised by your relationship with the state, perhaps your interest in getting state money in terms of promoting, the working of this legislation.
Well,
I think it's time you guys said, what is your real agenda? Is it to protect the public interest, or is it to perpetuate your own existence as so-called champions of rights? Because you only champion some people's rights.
You do it to keep the lights on.
I mean, I think we're getting to the nub of something all right here. So the legislation's proposed, it deals with two areas. One is hate crime. We have no law in Ireland on hate crime, and there has been a worrying rise in crimes against people because of who they are in recent years. We're unequivocally in support of that part of it. We think it's necessary. And on the hate speech part of it, we have concerns with the legislation as it currently stands. We continue to have those.
What are they, for instance? What are you, like, for instance, if in a school setting, or even in a social setting, if somebody refused to use another person's chosen pronoun, for instance, and refuse to recognise their gender identity as being different to what they believe, is that going to be a hate crime?
It's not. I don't know. It was first of all.
I'm asking Liam. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I mean, first of all, there's no suggestion of it being a hate crime, and it wouldn't also encompass hate speech, because the way that the purpose of the legislation, and it's not done precisely or well enough at the moment, it's too broad, but the intention is that it relates to speech which will incite hatred or violence against other people. Now, at the moment, the offences are not properly defined, and there's also offences in there such as the possession and preparation of material which are completely inappropriate. But the difference between where we stand and where Ronan stands is we have been working on amendments to try to reach resolutions to solve these problems all the way through. We believe actually that most people in Leinster House, and a lot of the concerns are shared quite broadly, are trying to reach solutions here. What we don't do is try to suggest that this legislation is part of a wider conspiracy between the state and others to drive particular agendas. And I mean, Ronan has made an insinuation.
But one of those agendas, and this is a quote from the Irish Times, Ms. McEntee said that she intended to continue with the new definition of gender in the bill, which has been criticised by some opponents, while gender, including in the law governing gender identification, has previously been binary. The new legislation includes transgender as a gender and also refers to genders other than male or female. If somebody disagrees with that publicly or online and says that there are only two genders, male or female, that seems to me as being a hate crime for which one could be prosecuted.
No, I don't believe that that's the case at all. I don't think that is at all what the legislation currently provides for, and I don't think the scenario that you're talking about will result in people being prosecuted for a hate crime, Neil. I don't think that that's the issue at all. I mean, I think we need to understand that there are two different things. There's the law about somebody's status, and we have the Gender Recognition Act in Ireland to deal with that. But you, Neil, might be the victim of discrimination or indeed hate because somebody perceives you to be a Catholic, a Protestant, a Jew, a Muslim, gay or straight. And we don't require people in Ireland to have certification or legal status that, for example, they are gay, for them to be able to say, I was the victim of a homophobic attack. And the same applies with gender status. So I think two things have been conflated. But these are technical questions which do need to be debated, and more work needs...
But people are maybe just waking up to the actual power of the bill. Like I could be here all morning talking about it, because don't people have a right to offend? And will that be criminalised, to offend someone?
No, it won't. And as I say, there is a lot of work that needs to be done on this bill, and we were making submissions on this legislation before Ronan ever was in any way aware of it. But he's made one particular insinuation.
Make a point there. Hang on a bally minute here. You guys are still holding yourselves out. The difference between you and me is you had concerns which you expressed very well initially, and then when you didn't get those necessary changes, you just got on board with the government and you've abandoned your post. I was dealing with the Department.
Ronan, that's not true. You know it's not true.
Sorry, please don't interrupt me. You have abandoned your post on this issue. You are basically a tool of the government at this stage. Whereas
our position on the hate speech provisions is exactly the same as it was in 2022. Our position on the legislation is exactly the same as it has been.
You welcomed the passage of the legislation through the Dáil in its extremely flawed and dangerous state. You have abandoned your post.
Yeah.
Whereas I was in touch with the department. You seem to have some idea that I only took an interest in this issue lately. I had a briefing and was asked some very hard questions of the Department of Justice when all of this was being prepared. In fact, there was one change that was made that was probably as a result of my intervention. But I have been steadfast in saying that, unlike yourself, I have kept to the argument that while there is no definition of hatred, while we have this radical new definition of gender, which could be used in all sorts of ways to suppress free and legitimate public concern and parental concern, for example, about biological males inhabiting women-only spaces, for example.
How are the civil liberties on that one, Liam?
Well, they have gone missing, and the
Liam?
point is because there is a certain ideological.
I'd love to answer the question.
Okay, I'm conscious of time, so just on
they should not be. They should not have said that this legislation should pass until those things are addressed.
Okay, final word, Liam. Go ahead.
Well, look, I think, people's good faith and motivation. I think one of the things we learned this week is that there are certain people in the political system, outside protesting on some of these issues who are not acting in good faith and think that everybody else is part of a conspiracy. Ronan's articulating views. I have different views. We can have a respectful discourse about them. But Ronan insinuated, actually said quite openly, that the motivation of our organisation, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, which has been working for nearly 50 years in Ireland,
take the money and keep your gob shut.
To take the money, and I just want to address that because it's important.
I think it's a reasonable question, Liam. It's a reasonable
Ronan,
question.
can I answer
No, listen, Ronan, I'm going to have to wrap it, so let him respond to that because I do need to move on. Go ahead.
I want to say something unequivocal about this. We don't take any money from central government or from government at all, and we never have, and we never will. So the insinuation that we're trying to get money out of the government, is completely false, and Ronan should withdraw it. So
I asked the question legitimately, and I'll ask it again.
Yeah, well,
if I see you continuing to fail to challenge the government on the very issues that you brought up initially.
Well, were you implying that they were compromised because of funding?
Well, there is going to be government money available. There is going to be government money available if this legislation passes.
Okay.
And there are.
That's not the point I'm asking.
We won't be taking it, Ronan, and we never have, and you know that.
Okay. And I'm glad you clarified that on air. So we now have to look for what is.
So you're happy to withdraw that they were staying silent because of government funding?
No, I got an answer to my question, but I will ask it again, and I'll ask other questions, because we still have to find the reason why they are abandoning the responsible position they initially took about the dangers in this legislation.
But we're not, and we never have.
Okay.
And it suits Ronan to try to smear other people.
Through the Dáil,
okay, thank you, gentlemen. Much obliged. I wish I had more time. Liam Herrick, Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and Senator Ronan Mullen. You can text 0868 104 106 on that one.
Winner of 2 golds at the IMRO Radio Awards 2022. The Neil Prendeville Show on Cork's Red FM.